Okay, I'll get things started. My name's Victor Picard. I'm speaking to you from a very snowy Philadelphia. Many of us are enjoying snow days today, though many parents are not. I'm a faculty member here at University of Pennsylvania at the Annenberg School, where I co-direct the Media Inequality and Change Center, the Mike Center, with Todd Wolfson and Sarah Jackson. And this semester, we are hosting a series of lectures and panels and other virtual events. I want to put a plug in for next week's lecture, Tuesday at this time, 3 p.m. We'll be hosting Dan Schiller, who will be talking about the history of telecommunications and US empire. But today, we are very privileged to have Andrea Wenzel kick off. She's our first speaker of this series I had just mentioned. And I'm going to introduce Andrea before I hand it off to her. I'll also have a couple PSAs to mention before we jump into things. Andrea Wenzel is an assistant professor at Temple University. She's also a fellow with Columbia University's Tao Center for Digital Journalism, and she's a co-founder of the Germantown Info Hub. Her research focuses on initiatives that aim to create a more connected and equitable communities and newsrooms through community-centered and inclusive journalism. I think we're going to be hearing a bit about this today. Prior to finishing her PhD at our sister institution on the West Coast, the USC Annenberg School, she spent 15 years as a radio producer and a trainer and project manager for organizations such as BBC Media Action and Internews in Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Iraq, and Ghana. And of course, today she's going to be talking about her brand new book. I've got a very dog-eared copy here with me, Community-Centered Journalism. One of the public service announcements I want to mention is simply that I urge everyone to read this book. It's fantastic. It's so well researched, beautifully written, and it couldn't be more timely given all the challenges facing journalism today and the journalism crisis that we all should be talking more about. So that's very important. Also, a couple logistical notes. I just want to mention the format of this. I'll soon hand this over to Andrea, but please feel free to post questions in the Q&A. I will try to field those at the end of Andrea's talk. I believe she's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes or so. So we'll have plenty of time for some Q&A. I also wanted to mention very important public service announcement, but for those parents out there, they're painfully aware of this, that these snow days in our material world also impact our livelihoods in the virtual world. And so we might have children bouncing in and out. And I understand, Andrea, you have a lively 1-year-old who I guess is not napping at the moment, so might be joining us at some point. But I really look forward to this discussion, and I'm just going to hand it over to you, Andrea. So please take it away.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here and to be part of this great series that you're doing. So I'm so grateful for that opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, if I can manage to do that. So I'm going to, as Victor very kindly mentioned, I'm going to share a bit about some of the research and the sort of touch on some of the findings from the process of researching this book, Community-Centered Journalism, today. But before I dig into that, I'm going to be upfront about what the book does not do. So the book is not a book about saving the journalism industry. There are other really important books you should be reading, and particularly Victor's, that address that a little bit more than mine does. But it is a book about reimagining how journalism could potentially better serve communities, and what that looks like might not resemble exactly the way we traditionally think about journalism. And along the way, I'm hopeful that the process of community-centered journalism could help to repair journalism and address some of the harms journalism has caused over the years, including the problem of trust. But my starting point is less about the industry and more about the communication health of communities. Um, So the questions that I get into in this book are influenced by experiences that I had working in public radio and in international media development. Before crossing over into academia, I had the opportunity to experiment with doing stories that now I would probably call either solutions journalism or engaged journalism, but didn't have those words at the time. I had the opportunity to start a weekly series where we would ask people to nominate someone who's doing something positive in the world or an organization that's doing an innovative approach. And that was something that when I at the time had been doing really depressing news about war and conflict and everything day in, day out. It was by far for me the most enjoyable part of my job. And it was by far the most popular thing that we ever did. This struck me. And it also struck me when I did projects in other countries where we would invite community members to share a problem that they had, and the reporter would go out with them and try to investigate it and understand it better. And so that kind of got me thinking about, is there a different way of doing things? And then when I was working in Afghanistan, I got to see examples of using community based research on information needs to inform programming. And I was like, this is so interesting. And it was for very different kinds of programs, but just the idea of having a cycle of research informing programming. So when I came back to the US, I tried to adapt some of that process and tried, doing community discussions to try to inform radio programs. By doing the work of journalism as a practitioner, I didn't really have the opportunity to think about, how can this be better? Is this working? How is this working? What can be done to make it stronger? Let alone what to call it. So when I went back for my PhD, I found out that a lot of the concepts I was kind of getting around the edges of had names already and traditions, long traditions, things like peace journalism and public journalism, of course. And there at that time, there was a new group starting out called the Solutions Journalism Network. And they put forward this idea that a journalist's role isn't only to talk about the problems and the things that are wrong, that that's important, but that it's also equally important to talk about responses to problems and rigorously report on them. And if you're interested in digging in more to solutions journalism, I recommend looking at their website because they have a lot of examples that are really helpful. Um, I started hearing the term engaged journalism a little bit later. And this term is something, engagement is something that can mean many, many different things. It's a very messy term. I think about it as basically a range of practices that aim to build relationships between journalists and the public. Also, to assess and respond to their information needs and to involve the public to varying degrees in the process of actually doing journalism, the journalism process. Um, Engaged journalism practices, they can be take many different forms, and one helpful framework is to think about it as a continuum from transactional to relational. It can be things like working. It can be more transactional things like clicks and shares. It can be more relational things like working with community members to produce and distribute content. If you're interested in engaged journalism, the Gather website has a lot of resources. I'm going to focus today mostly on the relational side of engaged journalism. Um, so I wanted to understand what happens when you combine solutions journalism and engaged journalism. And if you've heard me talk about this before, it's probably a little bit tired, but I do I think of it as the peanut butter and jelly of journalism. So each has is a wonderful thing on its own, but when they're together, are they not so much better? And so I wanted to understand this not just in the abstract, but in the context of places, of communities. What would it look like for journalism to try to build trust with communities by combining engaged journalism and solutions journalism? And so my book adapts a communication infrastructure theory framework, or CIT. And basically, CIT is a very utilitarian framework in a lot of ways because it can be used to assess the health of communities. It can also be used to design and evaluate interventions. And at its core, it argues that all communities have what they call a storytelling network. Basically, you have not only local news telling stories, but you also have community organizations. You have people telling stories, and so when the relationship between these actors is strong, researchers have found that communities tend to have higher levels of participation. They tend to share a greater understanding of a common sense of what challenges are in their communities and what they might want to do about them. And then at the same time, if those links are weakened, say if the community is divided along lines of ethnicity or language, or all the stories circulating on the network are negative, then that network can be weaker and those effects are not found. So I wanted to understand whether introducing solutions journalism and engaged journalism could affect this storytelling network. And I was particularly interested in communities that historically have been marginalized by a lot of negative news coverage. Um, so, one of the book's big questions is this: can interventions that use solutions journalism and engage journalism build trust and strengthen communications in communities? So, that's sort of the big overarching question. And throughout, to try to answer that throughout the book, I look at a series of case studies across the US. And so I start out in South LA, looking at different elements of the links between the local storytelling network. And in South LA, this is a majority Black and Latinx community. I worked with colleagues there and we organized workshops where we brought together local organizations and local media. And then out of this grew a solutions journalism series of stories. And after that, we went back to the communities, what they were about, and said, what do you think about these? We held a series of focus groups, and people were enthusiastic about the concept of solutions journalism, but they had concerns still about the who gets to tell these stories, and how can community members be more involved in the process? And they weren't finding out about the stories. Um, so this intervention, it was able to some extent strengthen ties between community groups and local media. They through their workshops, through the project, but the solutions journalism showed promise for contributing to more positive narratives circulating in this network about South LA. But without engagement, the residents weren't going to find out about these stories and had concerns about their connection to them. So the next case example that I looked at was I wanted to find a newsroom that was trying to involve the community in the process of making journalism. And so some of you might have heard of something called Hearken. It's a tool and a consulting practice that tries to let newsrooms invite audiences to ask questions, and then listeners or readers can vote on what stories they want reporters to go and report on. And the first place it started was at WBEZ in Chicago, and this project, Curious City, was their first project. And so they there will involve reporters in the process of will involve the question askers in the process of reporting, sometimes even in the process of editing stories. So a few years back, they took a look at where are the questions coming from, who's asking them, and they realized that they weren't really hearing much from majority Black and Latinx neighborhoods on the south and west sides of the city. And so they wanted to expand who was asking questions, who was involved in this project. And so they set out to do what they called an experiment to try to understand like what different kinds of outreach strategies would work best. And so I shadowed them as they did this, and they tried these main approaches. They tried just asking people face to face for questions, and this got good results, but it was very time consuming, not very efficient. They also worked with partners and asked them to help gather questions. They would put up question boxes in libraries and cafes. This had terrible results. Nobody used the boxes. They also did a Facebook marketing campaign where they bought targeted ads and they reached about 200,000 people with that, but they only got 14 questions. So it was, pretty expensive and pretty frustrating, and it didn't work very well. The most effective method they found was when they combined the face-to-face outreach with collaborating with partners, and in particular is a very basic old school approach of collaborating with libraries and setting up tables outside of libraries and talking to people. It gave people an opportunity to meet them on their own terms in a space that was already trusted to them. Um, but this also, it had, even this project, even though they found that was successful, it had limitations in that they didn't really do any marketing to let people know when when the stories were going to broadcast and how they might be able to be involved further. And so while community members, they got to influence the stories that were produced, there wasn't any feedback or follow-up. It wasn't kind of closing the loop. So in that case, the intervention did strengthen the link between media and residents, but it wasn't a two-way relationship. And so after observing these projects, I wanted to see what a model might be for giving communities more power to be involved in the process of making and sharing narratives about their communities, and also making these more solutions oriented. And so I explored two cases as community-centered journalism interventions into the local storytelling network. And the way I define community-centered journalism is basically journalism that's produced with and for communities and that centers both their needs and their assets. And so to set out to do this, I ended up collaborating with a colleague based in Western Kentucky, and we tested a model for a research-based local journalism intervention. So we focused on a majority white, majority Republican area in Western Kentucky, and we looked at how political polarization was affecting their local storytelling network. We did this through first a series of focus groups, story diaries, and interviews. And this is sort of the short version of what we found. It's basically, political polarization was affecting how people connected to community groups and to each other. But when it came to local news, there were outlets that people across political spectrums were still sharing. We also learned that regardless of politics, people were frustrated by a feeling that outsiders were stigmatizing their region through their coverage. Um, and so we shared what we learned in a series of workshops and conversations with community members, also local journalists and different groups that were working on engaged journalism and solutions journalism. And we got their input about, how might we be able to follow up? What, given these frustrations, given these concerns, what could be done in response? Um, and so one of the projects that came out of this process in these workshops was a pilot project that we helped to get going with an online outlet called the OC Monitor. This is the OC Monitor. Dustin and Lee Brasher are the OC Monitor. They're the owners, the editors, the photographers, everything. Um, and several of the ideas that came from this workshop looked at how to take existing community traditions and reimagine them. So one of the traditions that was there was something called society columns. And so this was, a very pre-Facebook idea of a way of getting updates on what was happening in their part of the county. So things like, so and so had a baby, so and so had a guest from out of town. So and so, also like substantive things like someone is sick and could use some help, and here's how you do something. Um, and this was the OC monitor was like, okay, well, this is something we have. How could we rethink it to have community contributors and have them, cover their part of the county that we're not able to get to otherwise, because it was a wide county that was hard to get to every part of. It was big. Um, and so that was one of the projects that they did with the society column, the community contributors. The other one they did was looking at something called liars tables. And this is the term that people use themselves. This is not my term. And in this part of Kentucky, if you go into a convenience store in the morning, you're likely to find groups of men drinking coffee and, as they would say, solving the world's problems. And this is, it's mostly farmers and coal miners and retirees. And this was how they would find out what's happening in their area. And so Dustin and Lee wanted to think about, how can the OC Monitor circulate the information that exists in these spaces and connect it to their readers who weren't connecting to these spaces. And so they did what they called a listening tour of liars tables, and they sort of go around from place to place and try to understand like what's going on, how can we cover this, how can we kind of contribute to like tying up these loops. And so we documented this project and tried to connect them to potential resources to take next steps. And so these projects in Western Kentucky were following a community-centered process. So we did a study of needs and assets, then we brought together people to design a project and piloted and monitored what grew out of it. This is not at all scalable. It wouldn't make any sense to try and do liars tables in Philadelphia, but I wanted to try to understand, could this process be something that is portable? Could this process be tried in other places? And so after that, I collaborated with some different colleagues in two areas of the Philly metro area. In Germantown, a majority Black neighborhood in Philadelphia, and Montgomery County, a majority white suburb. Many of you are familiar with these places. And we did a study with residents in both places looking at their relationship with local news and their needs and their assets. In Germantown, there was a sense that there was a frustration that coverage disproportionately was negative and focused overly on crime. Um, and in Montgomery County, meanwhile, it was more a issue of an absence of local news. So after we got these concerns from again, we had done focus groups, story diaries, interviews. After we did that research study with each area, we brought folks together to talk about what they might want to do in response, both in Montgomery County and in Germantown. And I'll share a little bit about what grew out of the discussion in Germantown in particular. So in Germantown, community members shared ideas that led to this project called the Germantown Info Hub. And it has these two main goals at its heart. So one is to look at how do we improve the information circulating within the neighborhood, things that the Philadelphia Inquirer isn't really going to be covering, but if you have family in Germantown, are really important. And the second goal, looking at the stories being told about the neighborhood and how these affect the neighborhood, the narrative circulating about Germantown, and trying to address those. And so they had these two main goals that came out of the workshop. We circled back with people and helped to organize a community advisory group. And then we've over time been able to have a small staff, a community reporter, and a community organizer, which is really the critical role in this project. And also, we occasionally have classes of students that collaborate with community members to co-report stories. Um, and we collaborate with other media outlets, and myself and Lachelle Crittenden from Jefferson collaborate to work on the project as researchers. So before COVID, the heart of the project was a lot of face-to-face outreach. And inviting community members to tell us what would you like journalists to cover. So people would go out and do tabling, use community organizing strategies to try to find out what people wanted, what issues they cared about. We also had weekly text announcements we're still doing. It's a different platform than we use now, but sharing events, sharing stories. There's a website, and it has a mix of community news, solutions-oriented stories, profiles, events, and resources. So like there's a COVID guide and there's some basic information. There's also now we have a weekly radio program in collaboration with G-Town Radio, and so you can find that there as well. With COVID, we started a community radio show to go along with it. So one of the most successful elements of the project has actually been its convening role. So it puts together every month, usually there's a community discussion of some sort. And these are traditionally ideas that come from things people have nominated and told us they want to talk about. So it's been everything from gun violence to trash collection, or gentrification. And so we do those. We also have what we call accountability conversations, where we invite local journalists to come out and discuss the story that they've done in Germantown so they can get input and feedback and establish relationships with community members. And doing so in a way that people are not really possibly doing otherwise. They're not coming in to work on a story on a deadline. They're there to talk, and the power dynamic is different. So this project continues on, and I continue to work with colleagues to monitor it. And of course, now a lot of it looks more like this, given the pandemic. We've tried to adapt the community organizing strategies, engagement strategies to continue to monitor and meet people's information needs. Um, and this project has had some success so far, but the argument is not to clone a bunch of Germantown Info Hub projects. Even from one neighborhood in Philadelphia to another, the needs and assets are different. And so the process of doing a community-centered project design would likely lead to a different kind of hub. But transposing this process model from Kentucky to Philly shows that the process itself can be portable. So just going through that process one more time, it's really kind of a simple idea, right? So we look at what are the information needs and assets. Then we try to bring people together to talk about what we've learned, bringing together people who participated, community stakeholders, local journalists, and engagement specialists if we can. And then inviting people to brainstorm what an intervention could look like. Circling back with folks to try to pilot those interventions when possible, and then monitoring and course correcting as needed to try to see how things go. So going back to communication infrastructure theory, these cases show how local storytelling networks can be weakened when there's a lack of trust, and how this can be caused by things like polarization, overly negative coverage, representations of communities, or when objectivity norms prevent journalists from building relationships with community stakeholders. And the community centered journalism interventions in this book are still in their early days, so it still requires more research to make strong arguments about them. But the hope is that community-centered interventions that draw from both engaged and solutions journalism practices can counter some of these barriers and start to build trust in these storytelling networks. And when people perceive that news content is for and with their community, that they'll trust it more. So, in closing up the book, I also looked at a number of other projects that try to put the cases that I looked into the larger context of the field of engaged journalism and solutions journalism. And these are some of the initiatives that I talked to folks from. And I argue that for engaged journalism and solutions journalism initiatives to strengthen ties between local storytelling networks, new roles and skills are needed, new competencies for journalists are needed. Most of these projects challenge traditional journalism norms and assumptions in some ways. They use skills like facilitation or community organizing practices, and those are often really at their heart. And I think these projects illustrate some different paths to doing journalism that is community centered. And based on the cases that I explored in this book, I try to conclude with some recommendations for practitioners in particular. And so, I'll go through them here. So look for opportunities to combine engaged journalism and solutions journalism. Try to let go of expectations that everything's always needs to be on the newsroom's terms, or even on the newsroom's turf. Like where events happen. Try to share power and have more equitable interactions when possible. Build relationships with different kinds of community stakeholders, including organizations. A lot of journalists have a bit of an allergy and a skepticism about working with community organizations, partly because of longstanding ideas about objectivity. And that's something that I think people need to really rethink a little bit. Establish feedback and accountability loops. Question the norm of detached objectivity that historically is privileged whiteness and authority. And then finally, I recommend for funders to think about community-led grant making and the process of and funding processes, not just projects. So I think sometimes if you just fund the project, you lose an opportunity or you end up not, it's not possible to do some of this work. It's not possible to really go through a process that's community centered. So all of this, it answers or it raises more questions than it answers. I will be honest. I think that I've hopefully, gotten some thoughts going about this idea of community-centered journalism, but there was a lot of things that it stops short of doing. What I said at the beginning about it not fixing journalism. So, these projects have a lot of value to their communities, but how can they be sustainable? So the projects that I've just talked about just now are primarily dependent on philanthropic funding. So there needs to be a conversation going simultaneously about sustainability, about public funding, about integrating these sorts of ideas into existing structures. I'm very interested in things like collaborating with libraries. And obviously, Professor Picard has a lot of great ideas about this question, and I recommend his book for that. Another big question that this has left me with, and I continue to be thinking about right now, is if community-centered projects can't be scaled, how can they contribute to a more healthy sense of local news? So, could there be something like a networked community information system? So this is something I've been talking with a number of different stakeholders here in the Philadelphia area, and I'm hoping to kind of collaborate on some experiments. Some people are already doing some really interesting work in this area here, and that's another area where I'm very interested to explore more. And then finally, I think it's important to really dig into this objectivity norm and if we can agree that it's problematic and that it presents barriers to connecting for journalists connecting with communities, then what next? So what's a positive framing of what could take its place? What does that look like? What does that mean? Could there be some sort of values-based framework for journalism? What values does inclusive and community-centered journalism center and claim? And that's sort of something where I'm right now thinking about a lot, and I think is something that I'm hoping to have a lot more conversations about both with community members and with journalists themselves, because I think sometimes we get stuck on the critique and need to try to think more about what is the positive framing of what we want and what does that mean in concrete, tangible terms, because people have been working on this for a while, but I think it's not translated into newsrooms. Um, so I'll leave it there. Those are the sort of where I've gotten to, and these are the questions that I'm still grappling with. And I'm much looking forward to this conversation. And thank you so much for letting me share that. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. That was fantastic. That was such an excellent overview of the book, and I agree that it raises questions, and also you could only cover so much in a 20-25 minute span. So there's much room for conversation and further questioning. And I just want to remind our viewers that I invite them to post their questions in the Q&A. I know especially there's a few of my students have joined the discussion, so I encourage them. Some of my students had a discussion last night during our class where we were talking about how we would reimagine a new kind of newsroom, and they were really coming up with some wonderful ideas. And this leads me to a question I have for you. I'm going to abuse my position as the kind of moderator here and ask the first couple of questions. But the title of your conclusion chapter is "To Repair or to Burn It Down." It's very provocative, and I think you were hitting on this at the end. But along these lines of, we're not here to just save the existing institutions of journalism, but we're here to try to reimagine what journalism could and should be. And I was just wondering if you could, I know you're very careful not to say that this isn't, a lot of these things aren't scalable, although it sounds to me like the process is portable. But do you have any general guidelines as to what these institutions should look like? You mentioned that most of them are nonprofit. I'm wondering, like, could for-profit organizations adhere to some of these criteria? So I just want to welcome you to expand on a few of those points.
Sure. And to like a short answer to my repair versus burn it down, it's a both and to me. I think we have to kind of do both. But I absolutely think I mean, I profile these like mostly I get into detail with like these very kind of small micro bespoke little projects that try to use this community centered process. But I completely think a lot of the things can be applicable to large, commercial newsrooms. That you know the basic orientation and absolutely the solutions journalism and engaged journalism approaches can totally be used by a newsroom of any size. um, and I think that newsrooms can find ways of doing projects that are community centered and ideally to kind of reimagining themselves in a way that could be at least more community centered. um, I am interested in ways of taking traditional newsrooms and putting them in collaboration with some of these things that might not look like traditional notions of journalism. So, can you have like a major metro outlet collaborate with small neighborhood level, or might not be a geographic distinction, but these smaller hubs. um, and could there be a way of these things helping each other? So I mean, that's one of the things that I'm hoping to look at more. But certainly in terms of just looking newsrooms looking in their own house about how what is their relationship like with communities, and can they adapt community organizing strategies? I think that's a really it's a simple, I mean, it's hard to do, but it's not rocket science. And yes, it takes resources that so many news organizations are already stretched, but I think that if they want to be sustainable in the long term, it's an investment that's worth it. I'm not sure if I really answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I have one quick follow-up question, and then I'm going to go to the Q&A as the questions continue to file in. But based on what you just said, and also what you said earlier, when you're saying it's like it's a fairly basic idea, this kind of community activism, community organizing around these outlets. And I think intuitively, or at least for many years, we've all been saying, if news organizations were just more accountable to local communities, we wouldn't have this trust crisis. We're now like hear this all the time, that people have lost trust in media institutions. And your research bears this out empirically. I mean, I guess I want you to, I'd like to hear you speak to that a little bit, that what you were finding is that when these outlets are in constant dialogue with local communities, that those communities have higher levels of trust in them. And a second part to my question is, and this goes back to my students' ideas last night in class when they recommended that news organizations have town hall meetings like on a regular basis with local communities. Is this something that you would also recommend? Do you have any insights to share on any of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I can make a pretty strong argument that not having a good, not having relationships with the community is definitely damaging trust. I think I need probably to be stronger in my arguments, more time to monitor some of these projects to be able to really like claim that they build trust. I think they do. I mean, I think like and through some of like the small scale things that we've already seen with projects like the Germantown Info Hub and the work in Kentucky. I think they build understanding and they build a very different relationship between the news, what people have historically thought of as a news media being far away and people providing information and news about their community. And that totally just changes the relationship people have and yes, I think people do have more trust in that sort of situation. Um, I think, I certainly could poke holes in some of it because some of these projects are very new and small. But absolutely the other way around of seeing when you don't make that effort, what happens, I think is pretty clear. In terms of town halls, I think that's your students raised a really great idea. Certainly something that we've been talking about in the Germantown Info Hub project is we do these accountability conversations, which is a similar idea of having newsrooms, either collaborate with different organizations and go out, not necessarily that they don't always have to be the convener. Sometimes they should be the convener, but sometimes they should, make themselves a little bit vulnerable by going out onto someone else's turf and making themselves accessible. And so if they've been invited to something to show up. Yeah, I mean, I think town halls can be structured in lots of different ways, but I think they're absolutely part of this sort of work of engagement with communities, and they can certainly be really valuable.
Thank you. And now we've got some excellent questions that have come in through the wire here. Flo's got a question, and I think this also gets at this, one of the complications with this engagement, that oftentimes journalists, professional journalists especially, are afraid to seem unobjective, that, their journalism slides into activism or advocacy, and many journalists are trained to avoid that. So what would you say to those journalists when you're giving them, you're encouraging them to actually do more engagement? What do you say? Is this something that even mainstream newsrooms can take on?
It's a really important question, and it's something that I think journalists and newsrooms need to be having this conversation a lot more right now. It has been happening, but it's not certainly across the board happening. And so, I mean, and even with journalism schools, this is a responsibility that journalism schools have to be having this conversation. I don't believe in objectivity. I think it's harmful. I think it's something that historically has been used to, have this idea that we talk to two sides and when in you know that these often tend to be the outcome of that process tends to be that you overrepresent people who happen to be white and male, happen to have more positions of power. And there's people who are smarter than I have who've written very extensively about the reasons that objectivity historically has been used in a way that basically supports structural racism. And so I think that it's important for us to make this plain and to talk about it. But even for people who maybe aren't quite on board with that 100%, I think you can be clear that engaged journalism and solutions journalism, if you're being an activist or an advocate for anything, you're being an advocate for information, for democracy, for communities, and this is why I think the idea of a values framework for journalism is potentially useful, because you can be like, these are the values that journalism can claim. And so I think that being an activist for your community or an activist for informed democracy is something that people hopefully can get on board with. And that you're not saying that, this is the politician you should support, or this is the policy you need to do, but you're saying, here's, we're going to make it easier for there to be a connection between a community and a newsroom so that there can be a better flow of information. So I that comes up over and over again, and it's important to kind of face it. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah, no, and thank you for answering that. That's excellent. I believe in it. I believe in what you just said 1000%. And you also anticipated one of the other questions that had come in about this link between objectivity practices and white supremacy. And I think, you're nailing that. And that's an important link. It's almost like journalists need to be re-socialized to think that, the traditional objectivity norm is not the ideal, and that there's different ways of telling these stories. Another question here, and everyone, by the way, is saying thank you so much for the great talk. Um, you said that journalists in this framework would have to learn and utilize different skills than journalists are traditionally trained to have, which again is hitting on some similar themes. Now, have you done work around J schools and programs to try to, encourage them in terms of their curriculum and how they can cultivate these different kinds of skills?
That's a great question. So, I mean, I've been talking with folks at Temple, and we certainly have a number of classes that try to integrate solutions journalism and engage journalism in the classes. And something that I'm hoping we do more of. I'm hoping we do more explicitly, looking at modules around things like facilitation skills or community organizing strategies for journalists, because I think, this is not something that journalists are equipped with naturally. We can't assume someone knows how to facilitate a town hall conversation or any other sort of, convening. They're real hard skills, and it's something that there are people who have that training and experience who can be very valuable to journalists to give them that. And so it's something that I think we need to do a lot more work on. There's other people in this space who've been doing some work on this. Sue Robinson at University of Wisconsin has been doing some interesting work trying to build some of this curriculum as well. And so I think it's happening at a number of J schools, and other universities. But I think there's a lot more that needs to happen. A lot of J schools have it's not consistent amongst themselves, so within one department you might have somebody like me who's like objectivity is crap, and then you might have someone who talks about it as being what we do. And so we need to get on the same page, amongst ourselves. And it's not surprising, given that if you go into any given newsroom, you're likely to find that people are not on the same page. And so it's definitely something that we have an opportunity to work with new up and coming journalists to work with them to try to grapple with this and have those skills. So I'm hoping that happens a lot more going forward.
And continuing on some similar themes is an excellent question here from my colleague Barbie Zelliser, who wants to push you in terms of thinking about beyond just the local and regional levels, which it seems like that's the focus of a lot of your work here, where clearly we're seeing um, you openings for more engaged journalism. But what about the bigger network? I'm thinking of the New York Times, for example, where trust is even more of a problem. And Barbie's wondering whether you can speak to this relationship, whether there's room there for solutions and engaged journalism versus the old model of newsmaking, which is still, even if we are perhaps detecting some shifts in practices, I'm thinking in terms of the New York Times becoming more analytical in some of their journalistic practices, but do you see potential there for even greater shifts?
I think there's definitely potential. It's harder, and I'm absolutely cheating by looking at the local level, because I mean, partly because I'm interested in I've been focusing on community members and questions of potentially bridging and connecting across divisions. I think that part of the question is a lot more you can wrap your arms around it a little bit easier at the local level than at the national level. But I certainly think that a large national newsroom can integrate processes of engaged journalism and solutions journalism. Um, what that means, what the community centered framework is a little different, but I mean, I think a lot of the techniques that you would use for, I mean, certainly solutions journalism is something that has been done at the national level, and engaged journalism has to some extent. I mean, there's more opportunities for things like the Harken tool. I think have even used by some national outlets. Making things more interactive, doing crowdsourcing the process of investigative journalism is something that people have done. So people have sort of cherry picked elements of it. I think that there's it's something that honestly I would need to think more about, and I think there are some people thinking more about the engagement space at the national level, but I think there's a lot more room there to really think that through about what does it mean to share power as a journalist when you're working at that level, and how do you kind of question how you're connecting with however you're imagining your audience. How are you imagining, what does community mean when you're thinking about a national community? So I think there's a lot more room there to explore more.
So bringing it back down to the local level, we got a question from Tim Neff, who's a postdoc with the Mike Center. Tim and I are working on some of these related projects, and he's asking, how might this process help address the increasing problem of news deserts, where locally based news organizations have already vanished? And what do you see a relationship there, where how we can try to address that problem?
I think they could absolutely be useful in that context. I mean, one of the things is I think we often have a certain idea of what a, a news outlet has to look like, or what a journalist is, and I think that I'm less interested in every neighborhood having a newsroom. Every neighborhood's not going to have a trained journalist or an editor or people with those sorts of skills necessarily, but every neighborhood, every community, every region probably has people who are sharing stories about that place. And so, there's probably spaces that are not traditional spaces of journalism that could potentially take on some of these roles. So, I mean, that was certainly an issue in Montgomery County where there are ghost papers that are kind of scraping by, and we had workshops where the journalists, one of the reporters who has to cover a gigantic region and has no resources. It's like I it's hard for me to cover a local meeting because I also have to do blah blah blah. And in those situations, then there becomes a question of could a outlet like that partner with in that instance, could they partner with a journalism school that happened? I mean, a university that happened to have a journalism class. Could they collaborate with the local paper? Could it partner with some other community organization who could do some work like that? One of the projects that I talked to in this book is a project called City Bureau is an organization in Chicago, and they have a project called the Documenters Program, where they train and pay community members to go to city meetings and document them. And then they kind of create a database out of this information that is accessible to the public or to journalists who aren't necessarily able to go to all these meetings. And they do a number of different things. I'm massively simplifying it, but it's a way of kind of reimagining who can do this work that we traditionally have assumed it has to be a trained journalist, and questioning that and thinking, can any citizen sort of do this basic information providing, and how can we then distribute it? So it's a very muddy answer, and I apologize that I don't have a cleaner answer about that, but I think that this process absolutely can be applied to an area that doesn't have, you know, much, if any, of a news presence. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm really glad you mentioned City Bureau. I'm a huge fan of their work. I think they're kind of an
great.
exemplar of what can be done. The next question is coming from Natalia Rahman, who's actually a student in the class that I had mentioned earlier. And she's got a great question. It's again hitting on some of these similar themes, but how can we make these newsrooms more appealing and more comfortable for local community members, especially BIPOC writers, for them to join these newsrooms and diversify the field? And I think that's also some of the emphasis in the discussion thus far has been, what can these news outlets do to go into the community, but also how can they invite the community in? Like, how could we actually have how could we just break down that barrier altogether between the community and the journalists and have like community journalists? Do you have ideas to share on that?
It's a really important question, and it's also it can be problematic if you're saying, "Oh, go out and do this engagement work," and all the people who are coming from the newsroom are white and, who are going into a community that is a community of color, and it's that can be really challenging and problematic. So it absolutely has to be paired with the process of looking at, equity and inclusion within newsrooms. Those things need to happen simultaneously. This is, something that I'm doing some other work on, other contexts. I've had the privilege of being able to work on projects with WHYY and the Inquirer here in Philadelphia, and seeing how they're trying to struggle with their own house, trying to think about how to make their newsrooms more welcoming and inclusive, and the challenges that happen when they're not. So it's absolutely a problem, and to be training, you know, journalists of color who are, like, you want me to go into this newsroom that's hostile or that's, problematic, or it's a real problem. And so I mean it's not only about increasing the number of black and brown reporters in a given newsroom. It's about addressing the whole culture of the newsroom and connecting inclusivity to journalistic practices. So the study that I had the opportunity to work with the Philadelphia Inquirer, a lot of there we had information about the numbers and percentages of how people were or were not represented, but it wasn't just about how often people are represented. It was about how, and it was about how the reporters felt about that process and how they felt that they had to change the way they were telling a story because of perceptions of who their editor might think the audience was for that story. And so it there needs to be a kind of a comprehensive reimagining of what an inclusive newsroom looks like. And I think that that will only make it more possible to do this sort of community centered work, because if the newsroom looks more like the community, this work is going to be so much more successful.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I also want to point out the fact that you've done a lot of this work on racial equity around journalism, and also, and I'm thinking of a report I believe you did a couple years ago on Report for America, and somewhat you had some critical findings where you were pointing out that it's a problem where it's perceived that these journalists are kind of parachuting in from afar to report on these communities, and there was always, a problem with this kind of disconnect. So I want to sneak in one last question, if I may, and I certainly wouldn't want to stress you out about thinking about like what you're doing next, but I'm just wondering, like, is there a sequel here? Like, what if you were to write another book, or perhaps you already are working on another book? What would this look like? What are some of the unanswered questions that you'd like to continue to explore?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in theory working on a proposal right now with amidst the pandemic childcare issues, but yeah, I mean, I think that partly I want to pick up on sort of what I hinted at before of this need for needing a positive framework for what we replace this problem of objectivity with, and what could a values centered values based framework look like, and what are those values, and how do we make those concrete by talking through what they mean and what they look like in terms of journalistic practices and norms. And so I'm looking at that. I'm also looking at sort of efforts, particularly in public media, to um, work with existing public media structures, but also to kind of think about, and this connects very much to some of your work of kind of imagining what a more public media could look like. So I'm kind of trying to grapple with those two streams at the same time right now. And I apologize, that's a very messy answer, but that's sort of where I'm at this particular moment.
Yeah, no, I'm already thinking about how I'm dying to read this next book. So I hope you write it somewhat quickly.
Yeah.
But also you should take some time off. This is just such an amazing book that you've written and shared with us. I really, again, recommend that everyone look at this, read this book. And thank you again, Andrew Wenzel, for joining us. This has been a fabulous conversation. I'm looking forward to continuing conversations with you. And I also wish you good luck. I know you have to get back to your baby who's probably waiting for you, but thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us all today. And I want to thank the audience members for attending and their great questions and all the wonderful tech support that we get here at Annenberg. We're very grateful for that. So thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.